All right, my friends, last time we were here, we talked about chapters 4, 5, and 6, really 5 and 6, and concluded a little bit talking about Hades, the chapter 6, Hades, from James Joyce's Ulysses. And we talked a little bit about the outsider status of Bloom, him being connected to Reuben J. Dodd, the Jewish financier with the humpback, and also the fact that his father Virag had committed suicide. And this is looked down upon by the people in the carriage side of him, who themselves represent early 20th century Irish Catholic Irish persons. Near the end of Hades, we also start to get a little bit more of Bloom's non-religious nature. He is not anti-religious. He is not against any religions, but he simply has his own beliefs. Traditionally speaking, you might say he's a little bit of a heretic. You might also say, because of his conversion from one religion to another, and this is a much bigger deal in some religions than it is in others, he's something like an apostate. Apostate is somebody who leaves his so-called native religion. Can one really have a native religion? For a different religion. And this is something that will come up in Bloom's head over and over again. His father, note this for a little bit of family drama, will you? His father, we know what about him and his own native Jewish religion? That he gave it up to marry Bloom's father, or excuse me, Bloom's mother. There we are. I'm getting a little too progressive. When Bloom imagines his father, he remembers his father being very, very touched by a play that was becoming big during Joyce's time, in which a young Jewish figure denies that he is in fact Jewish under scrutiny. And this affected Virag, the father of Leopold Bloom, very deeply. So he says this paraphrase, but he says these words have something like infinite mystery in them. They have infinite meaning in them. And he describes the boy who left his father and also the religion of his father. And so Bloom himself, Leopold Bloom, remembers the words of his father. He remembers that his father committed suicide. He remembers that his father thinks that Leopold left his father's faith, which recall that Leopold Bloom was baptized Protestant, but then converted to Catholicism in order to marry Molly Bloom, and so Mrs. Marion Bloom, as Blazes Boylan would have it. And so he feels tremendous guilt about this. He feels guilt as if he has let his father down for having left the religion of his fathers. But what is the problem with this guilt? Who truly left the religion of Bloom's father? Bloom was never truly Jewish. He's just ethnically Jewish. He's Protestant. He left Protestantism for Catholicism. Protestantism is not the religion of his fathers. Exactly. It is the religion which his father adopted in order to marry a Christian, an Irish Christian lass, Leopold Bloom's mother. But so when Leopold Bloom feels this guilt that was put onto him by his father, did his father put this guilt onto Bloom because he thought that Leopold left the religion of his father, or is he himself projecting his own feelings of having left his ancestral religion onto his son? Is he in some way suggesting, in a way that parents often do, that his son make up for the sins of the father, as it were? At the end of Hades, we additionally get more complicated feelings on religion from Bloom through his mechanistic way of looking at what a human is. He thinks about the fact that the heart is no longer, and think about the heart. When we draw the heart, we often don't draw a physical heart, right? Draw something like this, which is, students have explained this to me before. Do any of you know where that image comes from? It's supposed to be like half of a heart that was first drawn at some time. There's some explanation for why we use this icon. It's pretty interesting, which I recommend that you look up if you really like hearts. But when we use expressions for one's desire, one's will, or one's thinking, often we talk about our heart, right? Like, if you're sort of like a preacher or what is it? not a preacher, but a youth group pastor. You're going to, and the people in front of you have disappointed you. You're going to say, there's something on my heart that I have to address with you. Or we say, follow your heart. Or we say, have some heart. If we're talking about courage, heart. This is an organ that has captured our poetic imagination. And yet Bloom, when he thinks of the heart, he thinks of it far more like an engineer might think of it. What do I mean? I mean that he thinks of the heart as what it physically is, without poetic trappings. He thinks of it as a pump, which we know the heart is a pump. And it is in fact a pump that sometimes breaks down, leads to something like a heart attack, aneurysm, all sorts of things that are terrible and lead to death and decay. But that is precisely what Bloom sees all around him. In this so-called graveyard with these tombstones and these epitaphs and these these gravekeepers and these odd people called reverends and priests walking around and saying these odd holy words, often in Latin. For all of that pomp and ceremony, there are lots of beaten down, rusted out pumps in the ground around Bloom. This is what he thinks of what a human is. He thinks that a human is something like a physical machine that goes through its life and then eventually, and it's funny, and then eventually breaks down. It's funny, we think about, like, say, the Matrix, and how sad it is that, maybe we're not that sad, that certain programs like the agents get called back into the motherboard because they're no longer useful programs, and now their time is done and it's time for them to die. And yet, I have to agree with Friedrich Nietzsche here, where he says, you spend so much time being sad for the characters you read in stories. Shouldn't you be sad for yourself? There is no Agent Smith in the Matrix. He is a fictional creation that is himself helpful for understanding the mortal nature of all things, including yourself. And so one illusion that Bloom does not seem to hold is that he is in some way immortal. This is the great, I'm going to put an asterisk here when I use this word. So particularly if you're religious, discount what I'm saying as literary theory, not religion. But he has gotten rid of the greatest fiction which religion can offer to somebody, which is that they do not die. And so he is himself facing, unmitigated, looking into the horror of existence, this is him gasping with a hair, without some sort of book to get in the way of it. He sees the human heart as a pump and that he is surrounded by pumps that have broken down. At the very least, an individual with that sort of, who does not have religion, who wants to face the physical nature of existence face to face, is going to interact with the world in a very different way from somebody who believes differently. In fact, a question one might have is, what is the reason for such a character to act ethically? And particularly when it comes to how he treats, say, Molly Bloom, his wife, whom he married ostensibly in a church and in a church ceremony. What are the guarantees that he will act right? And then yet, I will say, as you read very closely throughout this text, there are few, if any, characters that act more morally, ethically, virtuously than Leopold Bloom. It is almost as if Leopold Bloom is himself something like an existential hero who sees the nothingness of existence and its end, and yet still chooses to strive on. His response to a world in which everything dies, including his father who is dead and gone, given how he looks, his son who is dead and gone, given how he sees things. This is a world in which nothing lasts. And yet, again, unlike a romantic, he does not commit suicide. He, unlike the underground man, does not retreat from the world, but rather continues to engage in it. Perhaps, hypothesis. Leopold Bloom's response to an existential situation in which the prevailing mores of a time no longer control one's thinking and behavior isn't to abandon society and all of the notions that exist within it, but to engage trenchantly with it. He makes himself useful to all the people around him because, at least natively to his own ethic, he seems to think that even if he does not know the truth of the grandest possible concepts in existence, one truth he does know: the people around him need some help. And they could really use his help because there are a lot of useless people around. It's very much a stereotype of Ireland, but a stereotype that was helped be entrenched by the creation of this text, that many of the men around him drink throughout the vast majority of the day, which we will see even starting here at lunch. Look at the newspapermen, Stephen, Buck Mulligan, all go get drinks, and not just one of them. And so in a situation in which there are people suffering and in pain, Nina Purefoy, who's having a child, been 3 days, Patty Dignam's wife, now saddled with debt and children, Simon Dedalus, his wife has just died, he has 12 children at home, no job. Is it necessary to figure out the most difficult epistemological, metaphysical, cosmological concepts? Or if one wanted to put a pin in figuring that those sort of grand theories out, maybe one might just reduce one's horizon of expectation. Maybe instead of fixing the world or understanding the entirety of the nature of the cosmos, one might try to do good to one's neighbor, for example, and do good by, say, helping one not to starve or helping one's children not to starve. I'm sure one could argue that such things are terribly bad. There's train analogies that one, or the train argument that one uses. If you had the chance to divert, you've probably heard of these before, divert a train, but if it goes right, it's going to hit 5 school children who have never done anything wrong. If it goes left, it's going to hit Hitler, but Hitler was going to have a child who cured cancer, so which would have saved millions. And so who do you kill? So it's sort of impossible to answer such a question, right? Like, how do you make that decision? In fact, because such a decision is so difficult, impossible to make, the doctors are required to give the Hippocratic Oath, which says it doesn't really matter who shows up in front of you, you have to operate. You should not be thinking about whether this is like some evil lawyer who's stolen from orphans, or whether this is Mahatma Gandhi or MLK. It doesn't matter. It's a human. You need to help this. So it's almost as if what Bloom has decided is, rather than getting overly cerebral about the difficulties of pure ethics, is that he has become far more in touch, down to earth. He wants to help those that he can see that he actually helps based on what he thinks helps right in front of him. And all of this begins to occur, or we start to get this image of him even from something as seemingly crass as him considering the human heart simply a pump rather than something poetic. So we move to chapter 7, and to chapter 8. Chapter 7 is named Aeolus and features the 2 newspapers in Ireland. These are based on real newspapers. In fact, the Freeman's Journal and the Evening Telegraph. I apologize for forgetting the name of Freeman's Journal last time around. And something I encourage you to see when looking at this chapter, which is itself very, very modernist, with its many, many, many newspaper headings that are continually put in front of us, newspaper headlines, is that this work is extremely modernist and is suggesting itself that the newspaper is itself extremely modernist. What do I mean? This text is sometimes seen, Ulysses, as a representation of the everyday life of a couple of humans, maybe several humans, but particularly Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom, Mrs. Meredith Bloom. But it is the newspaper itself which claims to represent the daily happenings of humans. That said, a novel, like a newspaper, is a medium that uses words. It puts words in front of people. But Something different about, I would say, this very strange stream of consciousness form of text, which uses spatial form rather than a temporal form, is that there's something natural about the language used in the novel. Natural, as in people speak like how Leopold Bloom speaks. Not as many people speak like how our Telemachus, like Stephen Daedalus speak, but some, ostensibly Joyce himself. But something strange about newspapers is the language that they use. Something you probably know is that they consciously dumb down their language. Something that was once said in various journalism classes was that you're supposed to write your general articles at something like a 4th or 5th grade level. So not highbrow sort of literature, but also think of the headline. A headline is a sort of expression that does not, that is completely unnatural. Nobody speaks in headlines. I don't think I have any of them written right here, which is terrible. Oh no, here we are. And even the very beginning of the chapter begins with, in the heart of the Hibernian metropolis. Hibernus, or Hibernia, is a Latin name, a medieval, maybe an ancient, even Latin name for Ireland. O harp Eoland, there, we have Aeolus there too. All right, I said a little bit about words and language. And we immediately draw a connection between words and language in breath, spirit, and wind. So who is Aeolus with this harp? Note also harp, stringed instrument, uses reverberations, uses the fact that air is present to convey meaning, the same way that speech needs to travel through air. And so Aeolus is a god king of an island called Aeolia, for him, that has 6 sons and 6 daughters who are married to each other. In the Odyssey, and especially in Greek, Roman, Egyptian mythology, a mark of divinity as well as dynasty, regality, being royal, is incest, royal incest. And you say, oh, that sounds kind of gross. It's like, yes, correct. Well, the idea was that, the idea is so elitist that it's absurd, but that royal blood was this sort of pure, divine sort of blood, and that one did not wish to dilute it. These are the notions that trickle down into the idea of nobility, in fact. And so Egyptian pharaohs would often marry their sisters. In the Greek pantheon, Zeus marries his sister Hera, has many godchildren with them. He also lays with many mortals and other goddesses as well. Has something like 100 children in mythology, only like 5 or 6 from Hera. So she's constantly angry. But Juno and Jupiter also are brother and sister in the Roman tradition as well. And so something one observes in the Odyssey is that characters that are divine, a little bit strange, not normal, natural humans, will eat different sorts of food. Maybe it's lotus in the case of the lotus eaters. Maybe it is something like ambrosia in the case of the gods. But in this case, we have these odd indications that Aeolus is not, and his Aeolian island is not a normal sort of place. And what he does for Odysseus. Odysseus has, at this point in his journey, incurred the wrath of Poseidon. And Poseidon has cursed him with a 2-pronged curse. Either Odysseus will die, great, or he will make it home, but his home will be in a bad state, which means that it's going to be being ransacked by potential suitors to his wife, who does not know whether he is alive or dead. Terrible situation. All of his men will die. Not the best thing if you are trying to seem like a great leader and you go out with 12 ships, and well, that'd probably be around 600 people that Odysseus was in command of. Brings back none of them. Also brings back no ships. So he loses what when he goes out to Troy, which he knew by prophecy he would. He loses everything. He loses more than everything. Not only does he lose all of his men, all of his ships, he loses all of the time that he had. Luckily, because of his running into these magical people called the Phaeacians, they send him home with some treasure. So it's not all for naught, that which he does. But prior to him making it home, after he has upset Poseidon, Aeolus decides to give him help. He says, I will put every wind, he's the god of winds, into a bag, Santa's sack, except for the west wind, which is going to blow you towards Ithaca. And so Odysseus takes that wonderful guest gift from Aeolus, and he makes it all the way back to within sight of Ithaca. There's some great details here. Here's Ithaca. Let's put a little flag on it. Gold. Here's Odysseus and the ship. These are the oars. You put Odysseus, he's got a beard, he's Greek. And I'm going to say he's steering a steering wheel. Because I don't know a lot about ships. I'm just kidding. He's steering the rudder. Homer's detailing here really adds to the pathos, the tragedy of the moment. What do I mean? Odysseus can see the cooking fires on Ithaca. He can smell the smoke. He's so close to making it home. But because he's been very eager to get there, and he's the leader, crown on his head, he has been taking the lead. He has been steering the craft himself. In fact, a very famous way of looking at leadership is as the captain of a ship, from the Greek word kuber nates. This is transliterated. Greek script is different, which becomes guber natis. Maybe even spelling that a little bit in Latin. Which, do you know of a certain election that uses goobers or that is based on this that America has? The gubernatorial election. Do you know who that is? That is your governor. And so the idea of being the steersman of a ship as a political idea is in the same way that being a pastor or a shepherd of somebody is a very old idea that goes back to the early works of the Christian faith. This idea goes well farther back than even a Christian, an ancient pagan idea. So the governor of the ship is Odysseus. But even though he is in sight of fires, smell them, is he yet there? No, he is not. And so he falls asleep. Z, coming up from him now. I sleep. And there's this giant bag. His men think Odysseus is a pretty wily figure. I think he probably wants to keep all of this money for himself, particularly because he's lost all of his ships, isn't coming back from Troy with any wealth. I bet he's not going to dole any of this out to us. And so when the cat's away, the mice will play is born out here. The men then open the bag. And what is in the bag? Terrible tornado force, gale force winds. And then that were restrained so that they could get home. Terrible winds come out of the bag, blow everybody. If you ever watch like the NBC version of this, it's really quite amusing. It's sort of like the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy and the tornado. It's amusing, but also tragic. These men are picked up by these winds that were meant to allow them to go home and are pushed all the way back to Aeolus, as if they've achieved what? Absolutely nothing. And so one connection I might make between that and the newspaper. Though James Joyce's Ulysses represents a day in the life of particular humans, fictional humans, as it were, often based on real humans, and real humans are. He represents a climactic day that is something like a day of days, a day after which nothing will be the same again, a day of transformation, a day when everything changes. Whereas I think Joyce's thesis on the newspaper is that it represents an eternal present. Even though the newspaper represents the things which are happening, which obviously change day to day, the claim of Joyce is that in fact, for all the changes that seem to happen, everything is staying the same. There's a great quote from Ecclesiastes, which Joyce knew very well. One of the wisdom books. of the Jewish Bible of the Old Testament. And the very first line of it, translated into English, is that there is nothing new under the sun. I think that Joyce's claim about the newspaper is that though it claims to represent that which is happening during the course of a day, what it is really representing is nothing novel and nothing new, nothing news, but that which is always the same. It's perhaps the character and nature of humans. And I mean, so you probably know there are lots of criticisms of the news in America in the 2020s these days, but one of them is probably that you've heard, that it always represents the same thing. And it's crime after crime, murder, and traffic accident, bad weather, and crime, and crime. And there are good reasons for why negative things get publicized. They tend to stick in people's heads better, and so they sell. If you publish on a tragedy, you are sure to get more volume of sales than if you're publishing on something good, like a jubilee, or like the president gets married, or buys a new dog. Those are sweet things that people are sort of interested in, but like it's like if there were a headline like Ukraine develops nuclear fission and is going to nuclear war with Russia, you can guarantee that newspaper would be bought in far higher quantities than something than if, say, Joe Biden were to buy a new dog. Okay, well, in any case, so this is man, Aeolus is on mine. Oh, yes, and this is a note that I really do need to include. After Odysseus returns back to Aeolus's island, and Aeolus, I call him Aeolus because of my Greek. His name is often pronounced as Eolus, and even so his original name is this, and actually it's this. Transliteration, I guess, be Aeolus. AI or Alpha Iota in Greek comes AE in Latin, like encyclopedia or pediatrician. OEs and AIs just become E. So we get rid of the A and it just becomes Eolus. It's the same thing with Aesop, right? Like, why is his name really Aesop or Aesop if you pronounce it with Latin or Greek? We pronounce it Aesop. So we get rid of the A part of the sound with the I'm forgetting the term for when two vowels are pronounced together, and yet I've said it so many times. In any case, Eolus is how most people say his name. I say his name as Aeolus because of my classical bent. In any case, when Odysseus returns to Aeolus's island and says what happened, Aeolus says, "You must be cursed by the gods. Be away, or go away, be gone from here." So he refuses to help Odysseus a second time. I just include that because that may be important to your own analysis and is in fact how the story ends. So Odysseus is offered everything that he could possibly want in this moment, and because of his own lack of endurance, physical endurance, he comes as close as one could possibly imagine him coming to getting the thing that he wants more than anything. And then because of his own lack of focus through the end, he loses it. I think you can yourself start to see the analogy between this episode and finishing what you start and not taking for granted that two in the bush are worth one in the hand, as it were. You've all heard that expression before, two in the bush, potential, one in the hand, real. So something real is worth more than something potential. Though in finance, that's not necessarily going to be the case. You're going to have to work with derivatives and things like that. So you're going to have a very sophisticated idea of what's real. Far more sophisticated than I am. All right, this chapter takes place at 12 p.m. and at 2 newspaper offices. It is just about lunchtime for them, just as it is for us. Both at Freeman's Journal as well as the Evening Telegraph, where editor Miles Crawford is. He's red-faced, heavy drinking. He's very much a blusterer. If you've ever seen Spider-Man or The Amazing Spider-Man, any Spider-Man hero fans, I've found Spider-Man's like not. I don't know if he's S tier for everybody. He's sort of a nerd or what. I mean, Batman's a nerd. But lots of superheroes are sort of like that. But Spider-Man works at what is his job? Very similar to Clark Kent.
Well, it's
Okay, yeah. Traditionally speaking, I know that the Spider-Verse has now been greatly expanded. But he works for a newspaper, just like Clark Kent. But he's not a reporter, right? He's a photographer. But doesn't he work for, I've forgotten his name because I don't really love Spider-Man, so I apologize for this, but he works for an extraordinary blustering editor. An editor that's constantly yelling. That editor is almost surely 100% based on Miles Crawford, who in fact it runs into Bloom. Bloom tries to get him to run an ad for Alexander Keys. He tells Bloom to get out of there. Bloom then calls back a little bit later, and he's told to KMRA. KMRA. Okay, so this is very vulgar, right? I said there's a blustering individual. Then he says, tell Bloom to kiss my royal, oh, here's an I, Irish, and then British, we would say ASS, they say ARSE, my royal Irish horse. And so he is very much a blustering figure, a windbag is how we might describe Miles Crawford. Yes, so Bloom says Keys will renew his ad for 2 months with a simple puff piece paragraph. Crawford blows Bloom away by telling him he can kiss my royal Irish horse. After chapters 1 and 3 and 4 and 6, this chapter features both Bloom and Stephen prominently. Bloom is coming east to do his job. Stephen Aeolus has returned to the Hibernian metropolis via tram from Dalkey, where he was teaching, and then walking along the Sandy Mountain Strand. And so now they are starting to cross paths. Remember that in chapter 6, we saw Stephen Aeolus cross paths with Bloom, though they didn't occupy the same space. While Stephen is done working for the day, but must deliver, very good note, Mr. Deasy's letter on hook and mouth disease to the editor of the Evening Telegraph. He comes from Northeast, Bloom comes from Northeast, Stephen comes from Southwest. They meet at the center of the city. You might start to see this as something like an analogy for how an appropriate balanced relationship occurs, right? Coming halfway is something that we talk about. The two do not interact, but Bloom does notice Stephen and his boots, borrowed from Buck Mulligan, as we've said a few times, and begins to feel some sort of paternal emotion. Thinks about Stephen. He says, he's got nice boots on now. He didn't have nice boots on last time I saw him. He observed something. That'd be like if I said something like that to you. I was like, oh, you seem to have gotten your haircut. You're like, I didn't think Professor ever even looked at me. And then noticed something about me. That's the indication that I would have taken on a little bit of paternal care, because I would have looked out at you and observed a change. And that's often enough to think, somebody does notice me. And sometimes that's enough, by the way. This is actually the nature of a compliment, not to be sort of weird to somebody, but to be like, oh, I very much like your collar today, or something like that. To say something innocuous to somebody is to show that you see them, to give them a very small form of recognition. People often like this sort of thing, particularly if you choose something they really have changed for the day and are proud of. Like they have a nice watch on that they don't usually have. They've done their hair in sort of an interesting way. There's a new pin on it. People give you signs, and they often like to see that these signs are observed. Not always, but just something to keep in mind, particularly with your own friends. All right, chapter 8, the Lestrygonians, eating and being consumed. My goodness, I really do know myself in some ways. The Lestrygonians episode in the Odyssey is one of the most major episodes, but like the Lotus Eaters, is pretty short and is not very detailed out. The most famous episode in all of the Odyssey is at least one of 3. Either the underworld in book 11, and Odysseus witnessing his own mother there, whom he didn't know had already died, and Agamemnon and Aeolus, these great heroes, as well as Tiresias. His encounters with Circe and Calypso, these divine goddesses, who both want something interesting from him. But definitely the longest episode is the episode with the Cyclops, Polyphemus. But this Cyclops Polyphemus eats something like 8 of Odysseus's men, and does not honor the Xenia, and is the reason that Odysseus becomes cursed by Poseidon, and why his remaining men are killed. afterwards. The Lestrygonians, however, at the beginning of this episode, Odysseus still has 11/12 of his ships, maybe even 12 of them. I say 11/12 because he's lost 70 men to the allies of the Cicones at the beginning of his journey. And each ship probably had something between 50 and 120 people on them. They were single deck ships, sort of like a canoe in some ways. And so they couldn't store a ton. When he makes it to the Lestrygonians, all of the ships dock in the harbor except for Odysseus's. He docks his slightly outside of the harbor. He's circumspect, as Penelope is often described with literally the word circumspect, to see around, what it means to be circumspect. Very different from the connotation of circumlocution, which is to speak around something, which means not to pinpoint it, but to trenchantly refuse. He sees a young girl. We don't really know the size of her. She just seems like a young girl from the poem, who then invites Odysseus's men to a city called Telepolis, where once they enter into a building, they see a giant woman who lets out a ghastly scream, runs out of the room. Giant woman, what does that mean? Like 20 feet high, 50 feet high, 10 feet high? All would be giants to me. And her husband, Antiphanes, runs in and is apparently large enough to, like Attack on Titan, gobble up the men who do not yet run back to Odysseus's ships. As they run back to the ships, the Lestrygonians are summoned, who are apparently cannibals. Remember that what one eats in the Odyssey determines whether one is divine or not. These lotus eaters, they don't eat bread, they eat lotus. Well, these figures eat humans, like Cyclops do. They throw a bunch of stones at the ships of Odysseus, destroy all but the one that was not docked inside of the harbor, Odysseus's. And so even though this is short, not very detailed section of the Odyssey, it is a terribly destructive episode. It is where Odysseus loses over 90% of the people with whom he is traveling. And so naturally, the episode of the Lestrygonians at 1 p.m. in Ulysses is about eating, and eating so-called ethically and unethically, clean and unclean eating. And I think at first you think, wow, that is a real reduction. Cannibalism compared to just eating and unclean eating. But think about it. In the same way that what and how people eat indicates their custom and whether they are civilized to Odysseus, does not what and how and when people eat indicate to you their level of civilization and what culture they come from? What are you having to eat? A quesadilla, a margarita pizza, some sushi? Perhaps you're on a college campus. Perhaps you're in several different countries eating their selected regional cuisine. What do you use to eat? Do you use your left hand, like many people in South Asia? You use a pronged instrument called a fork. You use two wooden sticks, like chopsticks, to eat. Do you put a napkin in your lap? Do you put it on your shirt? Does it depend on what you're eating, whether you're eating seafood, lobster, or not? Is there a difference between eating a burger and a Chateaubriand? Do any of you know what a Chateaubriand is? Probably not at this point. Let's say a tomahawk steak. Let's say lobster itself. Are there clear connotations when I say these foods to you as young Americans? Is lobster different from a taco, for example? What about steak? Are there particular moments and places that you go to eat a steak? Is it a celebratory, for example? Are you supposed to eat it when, say, you get a promotion, start making more money? In any case, just because what Joyce is representing is not necessarily giants consuming humans, which I admit, having seen some Attack on Titan and all sorts of crazy things throughout the course of my existence, that humans being absorbed or consumed by another creature is one of the most terrifying things that one can imagine. given. How is it that just sharing food with other people can be in some way similar to that? And perhaps this isn't an insuperable gap, but I encourage you to really think about this. So observe Bloom's eating habits and his observations, and judgments of the eating habits of others. Bloom prefers clean eaters, himself enjoys wine rather than beer or spirits. He sees this very sad Aeolus and thinks that she must be selling furniture. Why is she selling furniture? Because her father doesn't make enough money to keep the house that now is missing its mother. You see Daedalus later speaking to Simon Daedalus. And she's so very sweet. And Stephen Daedalus also has an interaction with her where he sees that she has a French primer and she's embarrassed at the fact that she's trying to learn French, and he thinks that she's similar to him, but not quite as gifted. And it's actually a very poignant moment because he thinks the fact that she, like a drowning individual, might pull him down. In his desire to help his family, to help his sister, he might himself give up his own future because he doesn't have the means or the skills necessary to help her. And it's something I highly encourage you to keep in mind always, that even trained professionals, whether they be para-rescue swimmers or extraordinary psychologists, lose people. Physically, they lose people. Psychologically, they lose people. When you think of yourself and your capacity to help someone else, are you one of those guys? So keep in mind Stephen's sort of maxim here that he knows, for as gifted as he is, and he's perhaps the most gifted character in the entire novel, he doesn't have the skills and the gifts necessary to save a drowning man. He doesn't have the skills necessary to save his drowning in debt sister, at least so he thinks. Perhaps this is a flaw of his. In any case, there's an interaction between Josie Powell, who's now Mrs. Breen, and Bloom. This is an interesting interaction. Hard to know that it's interesting on the first reading because they used to be lovers, they used to be boyfriend and girlfriend, and so she's Josie Breen to him, but now she's she's Josie Powell to him, but now she's Mrs. Breen, and of course we know Bloom is going to be is sure to be mindful of this, given Blazes Boylan's addressing of his wife by her maiden name rather than or by her first name rather than by Bloom's name. Something I have there, Nate, a little bit of French that you should know. Past participle, which means born as. So say if you are a woman or man or something like that, and gets married and changes your last name, and then you will from then on be Nate, your first name. That means born as. So just a little bit of sophisticated French to cleanse your palate. Okay. I'll conclude with finally giving you the substance to what I've been saying about the difficulty between Molly and Bloom. I might have to do this. Molly's impending affair returns to the forefront of Bloom's thoughts as he remembers an evening just over 2 weeks ago when the three of them, Bloom, Molly, and Boylan, walked together after a performance. With subtle stroking hands, Boylan and Molly made clear their reciprocal interest in each other. It's right in front of Bloom while they're walking together. And Bloom noticed, not stupid, the other side of her elbow, arm, touch, fingers, asking, answer. Yes. Yes. Yes will end our story, by the way. He spies Bob Doran bobbing through the street on a fender, then returns to his thought that he was happier then. Harkening back to the previous decade, the era prior to the loss of Rudy, he thinks, this is very important, so could never like it again after Rudy. Was he thinking of the copulatory act, the marital act with his wife, hinting toward what we will learn about the Bloom marriage in the fifth episode. There has been a period of 10 years, 5 months, and 18 days during which Carmel, of course, has been incomplete. All right, so as we conclude the lecture and let you go, note that we finally have the substance of what is missing between